Okay, good evening, everyone. Sego ani buju endio wachaya kwekwe. As the mayor of the city of Kingston, I offer these words in the spirit of this gathering. Let us bring our good minds and hearts together as one to honor and celebrate these traditional lands as a gathering place of the original peoples and their ancestors who were entrusted to care for Mother Earth since time immemorial. It is with deep humility that we acknowledge and offer our gratitude for their contributions to this community, having respect for all as we share this space now and walk side by side into the future. Okay, so with that official call to order, Madam Deputy Clerk, do we have a quorum?
Yes, Mayor Patterson, we have quorum. At this time, I'd also like to confirm that all members of council are present with the exception of Councillor Chappelle. Joining us from staff, we have Paige Agnew, Commissioner of Community Services, John Bolignone, City Clerk, Lanny Hurdle, Chief Administrative Officer, myself, Janet Janes, Deputy City Clerk, Jenna Morley, Director of Legal Services and City Solicitor, Laura Flaherty, Project Manager Planning, James Barr, Manager of Development Approvals, Sukriti Agrawal, Manager of Planning Policy, Manager of Policy Planning, Jennifer Campbell, Director of Heritage Services, Niall Odie, Senior Planner, Ryan Leary, Senior Planner. We also have Shelley Hurstwood, Director of Business Development at KidCo, and Brent Todderan of Todderan Urban Works. Thank you.
Okay, we were just meeting in Committee of the Whole, closed meeting. We discussed the new comprehensive zoning bylaw site-specific exemptions. So I will ask for a motion to rise without reporting, please.
Moved by Councillor Doherty, seconded by Councillor Hill, that Council rise from the Committee of the Whole closed meeting without reporting.
Those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, moving on, I'll ask for an approval of the addeds. We have a number of communications that have come in for tonight's meeting. So can I have a mover and a seconder to approve those addeds? Moved by Councillor Neal, seconded by Councillor Dome. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, are there any disclosures of potential pecuniary interest? Okay, seeing none, we have no presentations tonight. We have no delegations, but we do have one briefing. Paige Agnew, our Commissioner of Community Services, and Laura Flaherty, Project Manager of Planning Services, will brief Council on Clause 1, Report Number 98 from the CAO with respect to the new citywide zoning bylaw. Commissioner Agnew and Ms. Flaherty, you have the floor.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm pleased to be here tonight with Ms. Flaherty, who's the project manager for the city's new comprehensive zoning bylaw, as well as several members of the planning services team that our deputy clerk named off during roll call. We also have Mr. Brent Todderan with us this evening, and he's been specifically working with us through the zoning bylaw project with a focus mostly on parking, and he'll be here to help address questions that come up this evening. I don't think I need to tell the community or council how important this project is and what a critical place we are in the project schedule. The city's new zoning bylaw has been something that's been needed since pre-amalgamation or just at the time of amalgamation. And so we're over 20 years from that time, and this is a really critical piece. So we'll be checking in with you tonight. We're happy to answer questions, and Ms. Flaherty is going to take us through a high-level presentation that goes over where we are with respect to the second draft of the zoning bylaw, which is the point we're at right now, and also seeking some critical feedback so that staff have clear direction to push to the finish line, which is anticipated to be in February of 2022 with a final comprehensive bylaw for your consideration. Laura, I'll leave it to you, and thank you for having us this evening.
Thank you, Commissioner Agnew. Next slide, please. So good evening, Your Worship and members of council. My name is Laura Flaherty. I'm a project manager in planning services, and my primary responsibility is the city's new zoning bylaw project. So I'm going to apologize up front. I have a pretty bad cold at the moment, so please bear with me as I try to work through this evening's presentation and while answering questions. So before I get into it, here's a very quick overview of the plan presentation for this evening. The presentation is very similar to the one at Planning Committee in October, but I think it's really important baseline information that's worth repeating at this stage. So I won't be getting into every detail in this presentation, but if members of council have specific questions that you would like addressed, staff are happy to address any topic of interest. So obviously the new zoning bylaw is a very large topic that I couldn't possibly cover completely in one evening, even if I tried. We wanted to ensure that the presentation is as helpful as possible by providing the foundation for the work that was done leading up to the second draft. I'm going to provide some background information on the new zoning bylaw project as a whole and the overall timeline associated with it. I'll then give some highlights about the discussion paper topics that were presented at public meetings in April and June. And finally, I'll get into the focus of the presentation, talking about the structure of the new zoning bylaw, highlighting some changes contained in the second draft, explaining one of the key topics for this evening, the site-specific exceptions, as well as outlining amendments that are proposed to the official plan. Next slide, please. So let's get right into it with an introduction to the project and some background information about the first draft. Next slide, please. So when we look at the policy context in Ontario, the Planning Act is the legislation that allows municipalities to pass zoning bylaws and contains direction about items that can be regulated through zoning and the process that must be undertaken when passing a zoning bylaw. So the Provincial Policy Statement, or the PPS, is a document that sets out direction on matters of provincial interest related to land use planning, and it sets the stage for regulating development in Ontario. Zoning bylaws are required to be consistent with the PPS. So the official plan, or the OP, is the city's vehicle to implement the PPS. So it establishes the broader policies that direct land use changes while protecting natural and cultural heritage, managing resources, and planning for necessary infrastructure. So the current OP came into force in January of 2010, and the most recent 5-year update came into effect in August of 2017. So zoning bylaws, when we pass them, they're required to conform with the official plan. So zoning bylaws are the most detailed regulatory tool that municipalities have to regulate individual properties, and they're used to regulate the use of land and buildings, the size, height, and location of buildings, the frontage, depth, and area of new parcels of land, loading and parking facilities, landscaping and amenity areas. They can be used to prohibit development in hazardous and contaminated or in environmentally sensitive areas. They're also used to establish minimum separation distances. Next slide, please. So in Kingston, we currently have 5 main zoning bylaws that apply across the municipality. So the existing bylaws are legacies of the former townships and predate amalgamation. So 3 of the existing bylaws were adopted in the 1970s and 2 of them in the 1990s. So the patchwork of zoning that applies across the city is inconsistent with different rules that apply to different areas. The existing zoning bylaws also predate the current official plan, which was enacted in 2010. So this means that many of the existing zoning bylaw provisions that are in effect do not reflect the current OP policies. And at present, there's a disconnect between the vision for future growth of the city and the provisions of the existing zoning bylaws. Next slide, please. So before we get into the specifics of the second draft, I think it's really important to explain the project background and how the first draft of the new zoning bylaw was created. So this project has been talked about for over 10 years, starting back in 2011, which ultimately saw the first phase create a strategic direction for the new zoning bylaw for an RFP that an outside consultant would complete. The strategic direction was largely focused on a consolidation of the existing zoning bylaws. So phase 2 is led by an outside consulting team, and that resulted in the creation of the first draft of the new zoning bylaw that was ultimately released in October of 2016. So 5 years ago. In creating the first draft, the consultant first identified major areas that needed to be updated to better align with the current OP policies, such as the environmental protection area policies and prime agricultural areas. The remainder of the first draft was mostly a reflection of a consolidation of those existing zoning bylaws. So they brought similar zones from the existing bylaws into one zone in the new zoning bylaw, and they compared the existing general provisions to determine the approach for one set of general provisions that would apply citywide. So the first draft zoning maps use the existing zoning boundaries as the basis, and then updated the boundaries of certain zones for conformity with the official plan. So for example, creating an EPA zone to align with the OP land use designation, environmental protection areas. So on the screen in front of you is a detailed chart which identifies the approach to consolidating many of the existing zones into the zones that were included in the first draft. And this process for matching old zoning categories generally involved delineating the urban, rural, and hamlet areas, grouping similar zones together from the existing bylaws, and conducting a high-level assessment of the zoning provisions to ensure that they're similar. So the ultimate goal was to create a zoning bylaw which maintained very similar standards to those in effect in the existing zoning bylaws, with minor amendments to address areas that do not conform with official plan policies. Next slide, please. So following the release of the first draft, the project was put on hold to dedicate staff resources to other major policy projects that needed to be completed in advance of releasing the second draft of the new zoning bylaw, such as the OP update and the Central Kingston growth strategy. So when we talk about a new zoning bylaw for the city of Kingston, we have a vision to harmonize, simplify, and modernize the zoning framework across the municipality. So to us, in this third and final phase of the project, which is being led entirely by city staff, harmonizing zoning provisions is more than just a consolidation exercise. It means that the second draft has been amended to carry forward some of the existing zoning bylaw regulations, but it also means that new and updated regulations are included to align the second draft with the vision established by the official plan. So simplifying the new zoning bylaw means that the language and the maps have been modified to be as user-friendly as possible. So obviously a zoning bylaw is a legal document and some legal language can't be avoided completely, but wherever possible, we've tried to amend the language and the requirements to be more easily understood. And then modernizing the zoning bylaw really means that terms have been updated, uses better reflect current trends, and have been written in a way that's intended to allow for innovation and new uses to thrive in the future. Next slide, please. The second draft includes some standards that are still reflective of the original intent, which is to consolidate the existing zoning bylaws. Some areas have been tweaked and other areas have been given a rethink to align with our vision to harmonize, simplify, and modernize the bylaw in this third and final phase. So items that have been given a rethink include parking, loading, and bike parking standards, home occupations, site-specific exceptions, residential uses, complementary uses in places of worship. Items that have been tweaked include employment lands, schools, additional residential units, tiny houses, environmental protection areas. And items that remain as a consolidation include most of the zone standards and boundaries, except where they specifically conflict with the official plan. Next slide, please. So the timeline that's been created recognizes that this project is really urgent. It's a project that was specifically identified in Council's strategic plan and in the Mayor's task force on housing. It'll streamline the development review process by creating a document that's easier for everyone to use and is a key policy piece that will help to align development with the overall vision established by the official plan. So the third and final phase was initiated just over a year ago, and consultation included non-statutory public meetings about some of the larger tweak and rethink topics through discussion papers. And then the second draft of the new zoning bylaw was released to the public on August 6th, with the associated official plan amendment being initiated at the beginning of September. So we put out a request that the public provide comments by November 5th. And we had a statutory public meeting at Planning Committee on October 13th. So following tonight's meeting, we'll be working closely with all of our colleagues in the technical and commenting departments to thoroughly review and consider all public feedback and technical comments and address any of the directions that we receive from Council tonight. So planning services staff will also be presenting at the December 15th meeting of the Rural Advisory Committee to receive feedback related to the zoning approach proposed in rural areas. So following the final revisions, the current intention is to hold a final statutory open house and a public meeting with staff's recommendations and a comprehensive report. So at this time, we're aiming for final recommendations in early 2022, but this timeline may be impacted by the length of time it takes to address public feedback or other directions from the City Council. So ultimately, City Council has the final decision-making authority on the new zoning bylaw and the proposed official plan amendment. A 20-day appeal period would follow Council's decision, and any appeals would be dealt with through the Ontario Land Tribunal. Next slide, please. So since the discussion papers were presented at non-statutory public meetings at Planning Committee earlier this spring, I'm just going to provide a very quick summary of the content that was addressed in each paper and highlight the changes that were included in the second draft. Next slide, please. So public meetings were held in April and June with 2 discussion paper topics presented at each meeting. The meetings were held via Zoom and recorded. So if you're interested, please check out the recorded presentations on the city's YouTube channel. The April meeting had 2 discussion papers. The first one was environmental protection areas, the ribbon of life and water body setbacks. And the second was schools and places of worship. And at the June meeting, we discussed the power of parking, a new parking paradigm for Kingston, tiny houses, shipping containers, and additional residential units. Next slide, please. The intent of the EPA Ribbon of Life and Water Body Setback paper is to amend the official plan to allow the new zoning bylaw to better implement the intent of the riparian corridor policies, which means that the second draft has transitioned the protection of riparian corridors from a mapped EPA zone into a text-based 30-meter setback. So this change has expanded underlying zoning permissions to approximately 4,200 properties across the city without creating legal non-conforming use or financing issues, while still maintaining the same protections for riparian corridors and allowing staff to actually protect the features as they exist on the ground rather than unverified mapping. Next slide, please. So between the discussion paper and the second draft, we revised one of the initial recommended approaches, which was to exempt a small structure from the 30-meter setback. So the approach in the second draft allows for a small accessory building on existing residential properties, and this building must be set back a minimum of 7.5 meters from the high water mark. Next slide, please. The intent of the schools and places of worship discussion paper is to ensure that the second draft of the new zoning bylaw and the official plan treats public and private schools the same, revises definitions to focus on the use rather than the users, revises zones where schools are permitted, and revises the zoning maps to provide a more appropriate zone for schools within their actual neighborhood context. And then it also introduced the idea of allowing complementary uses in places of worship, such as commercial, office, community centers, cultural and educational uses, and catering kitchens, along with permissions for additional residential units where they're located in residential zones. Next slide, please. So the tiny house shipping container and additional residential unit discussion paper covered a few different topics. First, it addressed the new provincial legislation requiring municipalities to allow for up to 3 residential units on properties that currently only allow for 2 units. Second, it amended the new zoning bylaw to clearly recognize and plan for portable tiny houses as accessory units. And finally, it proposed to include shipping containers in the definition of building to ensure that there's explicit clarity around how repurposed shipping containers are regulated from a zoning bylaw perspective. Next slide, please. In the second draft, we actually included an additional revision to the definition of building to include formally portable tiny houses when they've been placed permanently on the ground by removing the wheels and connecting to permanent services. And this just means that those formerly portable tiny houses wouldn't need a temporary use bylaw to be established as an additional residential unit on a lot. Next slide, please. So finally, the last discussion paper, but certainly not the least, is The Power of Parking, a new parking paradigm for Kingston. So it was co-authored by staff and Brent Todder, who's here with us tonight to help any questions that are connected to this work. So the intent of this discussion paper is to really start a new public conversation about parking's connection to basically every aspect of how the city is built, provide a call to to everyone to think about parking in a very different way. So it connected the dots with some of the larger city goals and discussed innovative new ideas and options. So the paper examined the true cost of parking, including the many public costs and consequences of providing too much parking. It presented important ideas like reducing or even eliminating parking minimums, creating parking maximums, using parking incentives to achieve smarter outcomes like enhanced bike parking, car share spaces, and electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and all while ensuring that the supply of accessible parking isn't reduced. Next slide, please. So the timing of this meeting actually aligns almost exactly with the latest edition of Municipal World, which landed in our mailboxes yesterday and contains an article about the power of parking discussion paper, highlighting the call to action with the hope that it will inspire other cities to rethink their parking too. Next slide, please. So in the second draft, we work with Brent to identify some changes beyond what was included in the power of parking discussion paper, including some clarification around the only true zero parking buildings would be heritage buildings, and affordable housing has no general parking requirement, but accessible and visitor parking requirements apply. Rather than allowing reductions through incentives, the second draft includes reductions where payments are made under an updated cash in lieu of parking bylaw. So the idea is that the money that would be collected would be not used for parking, but to help to establish and support a successful car share system in Kingston. A new car share parking requirement has been added for multi-unit residential buildings in PAs 3 and 4, so along the transit corridors. Distances have been changed from 400 to 600 meters to align with the official plan, and they've actually been measured around walking connections rather than as a buffer from the transit line. And then parking maximums for multi-unit residential were reduced to 1. However, we've included a new provision that allows that maximum to be increased to 1.25 or 1.5 if all of the extra spaces are EV ready, electric vehicle ready, and if additional car share parking spaces are provided. And then an allowance has been added for up to 10% of the parking spaces in multi-unit residential to be small car spaces. And finally, the second draft includes new requirements for electric charging for bike spaces, weather protection for short-term bike spaces, and maintenance areas where there are more than 25 long-term bike spaces. Next slide, please. So on to the topic we've all been waiting for, the second draft and the proposed OPA. So as I stated earlier, since the zoning bylaw covers a lot of content and fundamental planning principles, it would be impossible for us to cover every facet of the document in this one presentation. So I'm going to provide a high-level overview of the structure of the second draft and also feature some of the rethink topics that weren't specifically covered by the discussion papers. Next slide, please. So looking at the zoning bylaw from the ground up, we have a text-based document which lays out the legal requirements, and we have corresponding mapping which identifies different areas of the city. So links to the interactive mapping or to download the text-based PDF are all available on the project website, the Get Involved Kingston page, which I'll speak to at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. Starting with the text-based document. All zoning bylaws are written in a pretty similar manner. They are legal documents after all. So the second draft of our zoning bylaw includes standard administration, interpretation, and definition sections. They've all been refined based on staff's experiences with our existing zoning bylaws. And we wanted to ensure that the document contains appropriate direction for dealing with a wide range of potential scenarios. So we have to ensure that there's specific direction that covers anything that could possibly come up when we're reviewing any inquiry or request for a development in the city. So section 4 contains the general provisions, which cover topics where requirements are the same across the whole city or across common zones. So examples of general provisions would be accessory buildings, amenity area, site triangles, generally permitted or prohibited uses, items that would be exempt from the bylaw, temporary or occasional uses, minimum distance separation requirements, railway, water body, and pipeline setbacks, and then walkway and bedroom provisions. Section 5 includes the overlay provisions where the requirements are tied specifically to a series of maps. So that includes floodplains, source water protection, airport noise exposure, additional residential units, and then the site-specific exceptions. Section 6 includes specific use provisions that are tied to certain uses, regardless of what zones they're located in. So examples would be tiny houses, gas pumps, home occupations, kennels, marine facilities, model homes, outdoor patios, food trucks, co-living units, backyard hen coops or pigeon lofts, schools and places of worship, and stadiums. And then the new parking, loading, and bike parking requirements are included in section 7. And then sections 8 to 19 are the actual zone requirements. So they would list the permitted uses and building types in each of the zones, and then the corresponding performance standards like height, setbacks, lot coverage, landscaped open space, etc. Next slide, please. So sections 20 to 22 are the zoning maps, the overlay schedules, the non-overlay schedules that correspond with the sections I just discussed. And these are all available on the interactive mapping website. Sections 23 and 24 are where the text of the exceptions will eventually live, with the exceptions that are passed under the existing zoning bylaws being included in section 23 as the legacy exceptions, and then the text of any new future exceptions that are actually passed under the new zoning bylaw being included in section 24. Holding zones and temporary zones will have text that's included in sections 25 and 26. And then finally, the list of administrative amendments will live at the very end of the zoning bylaw in section section 27, so you don't have to scroll through all of that administrative list to get to the meat and potatoes of the document. Next slide, please. So when creating the second draft, we identified a desire to use technology to our advantage and bring the zoning bylaw maps and schedules into a format that people can actually use and really understand. So the final draft of the new zoning bylaw will include the obligatory PDFs of the maps, since we're required to do it by the legislation, but the everyday experience is expected to really rely on the interactive mapping that's been developed by our amazing GIS team and planning services. So when you're clicking on the mapping, the default map shown will be the zoning layer. So this is really the foundational map to the zoning bylaw, identifying the specific zone that applies to every property in the city. So this can be turned on or off by clicking on the eye that's beside the zoning layer on the layer visibility window. And then all of the overlay and non-overlay schedules have also been added to this interactive map, and they can also be turned on and off with that same eye icon. A user can zoom in or out of the map and also has the ability to search for specific properties using the search tool with a magnifying glass up in the top left-hand corner. Overall, I think the mapping experience is vastly improved from the existing zoning bylaws and from the first draft, with the ability to click on the maps for pop-out windows that display relevant text or additional information. And opportunities definitely exist for future innovation with new tools that we can add into this interactive map, including the ability to add in advisory layers that might be helpful for navigating other applicable processes for new developments, such as CRCA or Parks Canada, Ontario Heritage Act, or airport zoning regulations, just as something to flag to people that the zoning bylaw might not be the only thing that's applicable. Next slide, please. So I think it's really important to highlight that the new zoning bylaw, which will simply be called the Kingston zoning bylaw, has consciously left out the word city from the title to reflect the fact that there are urban areas in Kingston and there are rural areas in Kingston that will all be subject to the same unified zoning bylaw. And although it will all be under the same unified zoning bylaw, the zoning bylaw recognizes the differences between rural and urban areas by creating zones that are either rural zones or urban zones and applying different standards to the two areas. So while many of the zone boundaries and standards in the rural area are a result of that consolidation of the existing zones, there are a number of important innovations that the new zoning bylaw brings to the rural areas by applying a rural lens to really help create a more vibrant and healthy, diversified rural area. So these items will be the focus of a staff report and presentation at the December 15th Rural Advisory Committee, but some highlights include implementing and aligning zoning boundaries with the prime agricultural area and the OP, which will actually protect the lands that are suitable for agriculture in a way that conforms with our official plan and is consistent with the PPS. The amendments to the OP policies for on-farm diversified uses and agriculture-related uses are intended to provide a more flexible framework with defined parameters that would result in a more minimal planning process through a minor variance application while still protecting rural areas from incompatible uses. The second draft also includes new hamlet, residential, commercial, and institutional zones, but we're actually in the process of reviewing these items and potentially creating one unified hamlet zone with broader flexibility in the settlement areas. The changes that were included in the EPA discussion paper shift the regulation from a mapped to a text-based requirement, so they'll have a positive impact on the rural area overall, since the protection will be based on the actual feature on the ground rather than based on unverified mapping. The second draft also includes new permissions for a food truck as an accessory use in prime ag and rural zones, and allows expanded home occupation permissions, allowing home occupations in accessory buildings. And while many of the parking innovations in the power of parking are focused on the urban area, because that's where the alternative modes of transportation are focused, we do think that the ultimate car share system that would be supported by the power of parking work will actually create new opportunities for rural residents to access car share vehicles. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the Central Kingston Growth Strategy is ongoing at the same time as this project, and it's studying all of the residentially designated land within the area that's currently subject to Zoning Bylaw 8499. So that's all the area that's shown in yellow on the screen. So through the CKGS work, the official plan and zoning recommendations from the project consultant, WSP, were presented at a public meeting before Planning Committee on August 12th. The zoning recommendations for these areas were integrated into the second draft, including changes to the existing zone requirements, as well as the creation of new intensification areas. An official plan amendment is slated to add a new section 10G, and it will provide policy guidance for the proposed intensification areas. So a statutory public meeting on the CKGS is scheduled at the December 2nd meeting of Planning Committee. Staff are continuing to receive feedback on the initial zoning recommendations and may propose further refinements to the zoning recommendations in the CKGS area, which would then be reflected in the final draft of the new zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. So one of the rethink topics that wasn't the subject of a discussion paper is the language used to describe residential uses, which in the second draft, we've removed the focus of residential uses related to people who live in a unit or the lease or tenure of a rental agreement. So the definition of dwelling unit is intended to be as inclusive as possible to ensure that all residential uses are permitted in all residential areas. So the only distinctions that remain in the second draft include group homes and special needs facilities, which are specifically identified in the policies of our official plan. Also, one of the recommendations of the Mayor's Task Force on Housing, which stated that we should welcome co-living buildings where apartments share common areas and rental costs per unit are lowered. And the second draft includes a new definition of a co-living unit, which is currently proposed to be permitted in locations where apartment buildings are permitted. And this is intended to respond to the direction of the Mayor's Task Force on Housing to help create a new form of housing in Kingston that may result in lower rents. Next slide, please. Okay, so on to the big topic of this evening, site-specific exceptions. What are they? So they are individual or area-wide amendments to the existing zoning bylaws that typically are the result of applications submitted by a property owner, but may also be the result of a city-initiated application. These are the applications that most members of the public and planning committee would be familiar with, as nearly every rezoning application that's considered at a public meeting is requesting some form of site-specific exception to the zoning bylaw. So at a very basic level, they say, despite what the zoning bylaw says on your property, you may only develop for this specific use, and here are the standards that you must meet. So obviously this is a generalization and there are variations to the way that exceptions are written, but this is the basic approach. So when we started preparing the second draft, we knew exceptions would be one of the largest tasks that needed to be addressed. The first draft simply said we should carry forward all of the existing exceptions and recognize those in the new zoning bylaw. So in reviewing this approach, we've identified some potential OP conformity issues, since we have some zoning bylaws that are around 45 years old, and the current OP has only been in effect for around 11 years. So this means that there are nearly 35 years worth of exceptions that were passed by different municipalities in different zoning bylaws before the current official plan existed. So before I go any further, as a reminder, the new zoning bylaw must conform with the official plan. When we say this, we don't just mean that the use has to be a permitted use in the zone. All of the policies that are applicable must be satisfied. So including policies that speak to built forms such as land use compatibility, natural heritage, natural hazards, cultural heritage, and urban design policies. So reviewing each exception for conformity with the OP is an extremely time-consuming task, and it requires a detailed analysis of each provision. So when the second draft was released, we identified that we were going to looking for public feedback on the ultimate approach to the older exceptions. So the second draft was formulated in a manner that would best facilitate this conversation and the access to the information. So the exceptions were pulled out into their own schedule, and the interactive map now shows a pop-out screen with the text of the exception when you click on any shape. The second draft included a color-coded exceptions to categorize the age of the exception. So green exceptions represent those that were passed after the current OP came into effect, red exceptions generally represent those that were passed prior to the current OP, and they may or may not conform with the OP. A few new exceptions also had to be created to better transition from the existing zoning bylaws or to recognize site-specific OP policies. And they're shown in the blue category. Next slide, please. So 2 potential options were identified within the current scope, timeline, and available resources for this project. Number 1 was removing these properties from the new zoning bylaw, giving them a hold on all of the relevant mapping, which states that these properties are not subject to the new zoning bylaw. So this would allow for all of the existing permissions to remain in full force and effect without the need to review these exceptions for conformity against the official plan. So this approach would also require that the existing zoning bylaws are not repealed in their entirety, and that the existing zoning bylaws will continue to apply to these properties and will continue to be used by staff and members of the public. And then option number 2 is to delete the exceptions and allow the legal non-conforming use provisions of the Planning Act and the corresponding section 1.8 of the zoning bylaw to apply to these properties, without recognizing the existing exceptions. So this means that the uses would likely no longer be fully permitted, but recognized as legal non-conforming uses, and may continue as long as they are continuously used for that purpose. Next slide, please. So since we released the second draft, we've been working really hard to review some of the area-wide exceptions that were previously shown in the red category. We've undertaken this work because they generally represent larger residential subdivisions and impact a very large number of properties in the city. So from an OP review standpoint, these also represent the exceptions that are likely the easiest to review for OP conformity, since they're often dealing with lot area, lot frontage, and other similar standards that apply to low-rise residential development on residentially designated lands. So we hope to move as many of these exceptions as possible into the green category, or even potentially delete as many of these exceptions as possible by updating the parent residential zones that may apply to these areas before final recommendations are made on this project. And that would ensure that the new zoning bylaw applies to the large majority of properties in the city. Next slide, please. So when we look at the numbers and the maps, I think the most impactful statistic is shown in the left-hand pie chart on your screen. So out of all of the properties in the city, all 41,899 of them, 51% of the properties are currently subject to a site-specific exception. So more than half of all properties in the city. So as you can see in the pie chart on the left, moving the large area-wide exceptions from the red category into the yellow category captured 15,586 properties, which represents approximately 37% of the total number of properties in the city. So from a staff resource perspective, reviewing those yellow exceptions really helps to ensure that the new zoning bylaw is as effective as possible. So what we're actually looking at here when we talk about the red exceptions are the 1,911 properties, which represents about 5% of the properties in the city. Next slide, please. So to sum it all up, staff are looking for direction from council tonight on the approach that should be taken with the red exceptions in the final version of the new zoning bylaw when it's brought forward in 2022. So our preferred approach is to provide holes for these exceptions, which means that the existing zoning bylaws will continue to apply to these properties, existing permissions will continue, and they will not be subject to the new zoning bylaw. Over the next number of years, staff would then proactively bring as many properties as possible into the new zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. So when we were putting together the discussion papers on the second draft of the new zoning bylaw, we identified several areas where amendments to the OP would allow us to draft zoning requirements that will actually implement the intent of the policies in a more appropriate manner. So the majority of the proposed amendments were covered by the discussion paper topics, including amendments to additional residential units, tiny houses, places of worship, schools, EPA, and riparian corridor policies. The only changes proposed to the mapping are related specifically to the riparian corridors. Some additional amendments have been proposed to the on-farm diversified uses and the agricultural related use policies, as I mentioned earlier, and also to complementary use provisions within employment areas. And these proposed amendments are to ensure that these use can proceed through a straightforward minor variance application where it's appropriate, with specific intention identified in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. So we've obviously received a lot of public feedback and participated in many meetings and events with stakeholders and interested members of the public. The staff report and addendum have included the written comments that, sorry. And I've included a couple bullet points on the slide to represent just some of the ideas and feedback that have come through. So overall, we've received a number of positive comments that acknowledge the improvements that have been made within the second draft. And the majority of the comments can be easily addressed and accommodated within the next draft, except for comments that don't align with the current official plan policies. So one of the larger topics that has come from a variety of sources is the need to rethink the UR1, UR2, and UR3 zones, which are primarily the residential zones located in subdivisions in the former Kingston and Pittsburgh townships. These zones are really remnants of the initial consolidation from the first draft. So we've begun the process of reviewing the existing zones and the existing area-wide exceptions, mostly the larger yellow ones that I spoke about earlier, with the intent of creating new subdivision residential zones that are more reflective of the form and function of these neighborhoods. And then over the next few months, we'll be doing a deep dive into all of the comments and suggestions and ensure that revisions are proposed in the next draft to provide meaningful feedback or to respond to the meaningful feedback that's been provided. Next slide, please. So before we end the presentation tonight, I did want to speak very quickly to the strategic plan. So as legal documents, zoning bylaws are required to have measurable objective standards that can be very clearly defined and applied. So when it comes to council's strategic plan, the zoning bylaw was specifically identified as a project to enable more housing development and to help increase housing affordability. While the 5 main priorities are not measurable standards that are specifically stated in the zoning bylaw, all of the work that we've done as staff have been informed and impacted by these priorities. So for example, demonstrating leadership on climate action has had a substantial impact on the power of parking discussion paper and the ultimate parking, car share and bike parking requirements that are in the second draft, ensuring that the new zoning bylaw not only supports development in transit and active transportation supported locations, but also supports the creation of infrastructure supporting active transportation and car share. And while the new zoning bylaw has been primarily formatted as a consolidation of the existing zoning bylaws, we've taken every opportunity possible to introduce density in locations that can support it from an infrastructure perspective. Increasing housing affordability is not something that we can control directly in the new zoning bylaw, as we can't control the economics of the housing market, but the zoning bylaw has the potential to have an impact on housing affordability in general by permitting the creation of additional residential units and the new residential housing forms such as co-living units. The power of parking has also connected the dots between providing parking and the cost of providing parking and the cost of housing, ensuring that the zoning bylaw standards are not unnecessarily increasing the cost of new housing, because that gets passed directly on to the ultimate tenants or owners of the units. It also has direct connections to improving walkability, roads, and transportation by ensuring that new developments can be built with a more compact built form with less parking, supporting walkable neighborhoods and communities. Strengthening economic development ideas permeate throughout the new zoning bylaw by ensuring that land use definitions are written in a more permissive and general fashion in the various commercial and employment zones. So we recognize that there'll be more work to be done to support density and mixed uses in the right locations across the city, and expect that future work that's done by the Density by Design project, as well as the next OP update, will have a major impact with a greater focus on climate change, housing affordability, and other priorities of council. So the ultimate goal is to more fully connect the dots between land use planning and climate change. So future policy changes in these projects would then be complemented by proposed amendments to the new zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. So finally, there are many ways that members of the public can provide comments and access the second draft and the proposed OPA. So the agenda package includes the majority of the information with all of the links. The information can also be found on both the project website as well as the Get Involved Kingston webpage. I'm maintaining a project email list where I send updates when new documents are published or events are scheduled, and written comments can be sent via email or mail, and staff are available to speak on the phone or meet virtually with interested members of the public. Next slide, please. And with that, our formal presentation is over, and I'll turn it back to you, Your Worship.
Thank you very much, Ms. Flaherty. So at this point, we will open up the floor to questions from council. First up is Deputy Mayor Ostroff.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Patterson, and excellent presentation, Laura. There's a lot there. I'm not, it'll take us more than one night to understand all this, but really, one question I have, so I guess you don't really deal with it, but is there like tax implications when we consider the complementary uses like of farms, of places of worship and residential and all that? How, is that something that planning has to consider and keep in mind?
Ms. Flaherty.
Through you, Your Worship. Thank you, Councillor Oosterhoff. From a planning perspective, it's not a test that we would apply when we're considering what the appropriate land use planning policies are to include in a new zoning bylaw. It's certainly something that members of the public should be aware of when they're looking to introduce new uses and take advantage of some of the increased permissions that would be on their property. If they are taking advantage, there certainly could be tax implications, and I would encourage them to think about that, and they can certainly reach out to planning staff, and we can direct them to the appropriate people in our tax services department.
So that is a calculation, but that is a consideration when people, even the impact of all that we're doing right now, there will be a greater tax gain for the city. Through your worship, I might pass this question on to Commissioner Agnew to speak to the practices of our tax services department.
Agnew.
Thank you, and through you, Your Worship. By no means am I a tax expert, but certainly taxation is linked to the type of land use and the type of tax category. When there's new residential, for example, that's created at the time that the new residential use is occupied, there is typically a change of a tax category from something that was vacant land to occupied land, and they have different rates of taxation. The same would be true of commercial rates of taxation and so forth. So as Ms. Flaherty indicated, although that's not a key indicator from our perspective in planning and directing the appropriateness of different types of land uses in different locations, the change of land uses or the additional permissions or changing your property or taking advantage of some of those permissions could have tax implications. And that's where due diligence on behalf of the property owner in reaching out and we can make some connections with taxation services that would be helpful in that respect.
Yeah, no, I do applaud the look here, but that is something that like, so with churches and schools and that, and even farms have reduced taxation, but you know, schools and places of worship don't have a taxation. So that would be a new situation for them to consider if the permissions of uses is expanded.
Thank you, and through you potentially, and Councillor Oosterhoff, I'm happy to take that away and drill into that a little bit more in detail and provide some follow-up information. Yeah. I think it would really depend on what the actual use that's transpiring on the property. So certainly just a change or any permissions into the zone category wouldn't necessarily change taxation status. It would only be acted upon if that property owner took advantage and created a new use or introduced a new use on the property. But that would be different circumstances for not-for-profits and places of worship versus residential, commercial. So I wouldn't want to speak at a turn and going much further, but I'm happy to get some additional information for you on that if you want to share that with any of your constituents.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Point of order, Councillor Kyle.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson. Through you, I just wanted to confirm this is not a committee of the whole, correct? We're following the normal procedures of questions for the presentation, moving it on the floor, then questions or comments on the motion. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So we're under the regular rules of council. So because it's a briefing, it is unlimited questions at this point. And then once we move the staff recommendation, then as per usual, everyone has up to 5 minutes to speak, and then you can ask additional questions, but that counts towards your time.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Okay, next is Councillor Hill.
Thank you. And I guess this question will go to staff, to Laura. So the difference between the holes approach versus the legal non-conforming, at least in my sense, and I think the concern maybe that some councillors would have is that if somebody wanted to make like a whole scale change and they were in a hole, how would council have some control over that? Would that be through site control or because if it was legal non-conforming, it would have to come back to planning committee, I'm assuming, for approval, where with the holes, I'm not sure that it would have to do that. So would council exercise its control through site control then? Is that sort of what's being proposed?
Ms. Flaherty.
Through you, your worship. So it's difficult to answer these questions hypothetically because there are so many permeations of how the exceptions are written and potential development interests on any individual property. So if the exceptions are generally written in a very restrictive way that is focused on a specific form of development. So say someone wanted to develop the site with something that was different from what the exception permitted. Even if in the holes approach, they would likely be required to ask for a rezoning application to enable a different form of development to happen. And that would be reviewed against the policies of the official plan. And any rezoning, we would then take that property into the new zoning bylaw and create a site-specific exception under the new zoning bylaw for that development. If you were to take the approach of deleting the exception and someone wanted to potentially expand their building, they might actually be able to go through something called a legal non-conforming use. It would be a permission that would proceed through an application under Section 45 of the Planning Act, and that would actually go to the Committee of Adjustment. And it doesn't have the same tests as a rezoning application. So legal non-conforming use permissions, which would be an expansion, they actually aren't required to conform with the official plan. So they might actually be able to do some level of development under legal non-conforming use rights that you actually wouldn't be able to get under the same OP policies, depending on the actual specific context.
So what you're suggesting, I think, is then that we probably would have more control using the holes approach than we would having using the legal non-conforming. Is that correct?
Through you, your worship, depending on the scenario, yes, there's a potential that you would have more control through the holes approach because it would still be complying with the zoning bylaw, and they would likely just ask for a rezoning application if they were seeking to do something different on that property, which would be required to conform with the official plan.
Okay, thank you very much.
Next is Councillor Neal.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation. Couple of quick questions. I came into this tonight thinking existing non-conforming use was probably the way I was going to go, and I'm not so sure anymore. So as I understand existing non-conforming use, which is my understanding is in a much smaller context, you know, somebody gets a ticket because they have two cars parked, one in front of their house, and it turns out that the bylaw restricting that happened after that was already the practice. So that's the kind of thing that I've always thought of as existing non-conforming use, or somebody's garage is slightly closer to their neighbor, that kind of thing. But this is a much more expansive existing non-conforming use. Now, existing non-conforming use, as I understand it, freezes and restricts any expansion beyond the existing conforming use. I see you nodding, so thank you. I do understand. So that, in my mind, the reason I was leaning that way was that prevents too expansive an adjustment to that site. without them having to come back through a full application. The holes approach, as you've explained it, allows for them to say, come to you and say, look, if we do this, this, and this, it'll comply with the new zoning bylaw. And if that's the case, it can get approved. Is that accurate?
Through you, your worship. So with the holes approach, they would only be required to conform with the existing zoning bylaw. So say it's a property that's currently subject to zoning bylaw 8499 and they have a site specific exception under 8499. The holes approach would mean that they only need to comply with zoning bylaw 8499. They don't need to comply with the new zoning bylaw because they would be a hole from the new zoning bylaw.
Okay, but if that's more restrictive than the new zoning bylaw, how can they go about to bring it into compliance and acceptance within the new zoning bylaw so we can take them out of that red zone?
Through you, your worship. So there are likely a number of existing red exceptions that would be less permissive than the new zoning bylaw would. So the new zoning bylaw permissions for commercial and employment uses have been written in a much broader way to allow for different types of commercial uses to be located in commercial zones, whereas many of the existing zones have very, very specific uses. Some of the employment zones actually have the specific products that are being manufactured in the existing zoning bylaws. So there's definitely a potential that some of those red exceptions are actually more restrictive than the new zoning bylaw would be. So there might be scenarios where a property owner looks at their site-specific exception, their red exception, and they say, I'd actually rather the new zoning bylaw apply here, and I'd like to get rid of my exception. And I encourage those property owners to contact staff and tell us that so that we can work on those properties and delete those exceptions where it's appropriate. So if that was the case after the new zoning bylaw is passed, I would expect that any of those types of requests, we would review through that proactive completion of reviewing the red exceptions and trying to bring them into the new zoning bylaw. So it might end up being that some of that review is, hey, look, this exception actually really restricts it, and we'd like for the new zoning bylaw to just apply without an exception.
Thank you. If is your hope and expectation, as mine is, that within a few years, under the holes approach, we'll have far fewer red zones than we would under the other application. Is that an expectation that you share?
Through your worship. So there will be no holes under the deleting all of those exceptions, legal non-conforming use option. So there would be no holes in that scenario. So under the holes approach, there will always be more holes than under the other approach because there's no holes in the other approach. I certainly think that over time, as staff are able to proactively review those red exceptions, the new zoning bylaw would be a lot cleaner because we'd actually be able to bring those properties into conformity with the existing or the new zoning bylaw, rather than having those properties continuously be legal non-conforming. So when we talk about legal non-conforming, I think it's really important that the existing zoning bylaws still are very much part of the equation, because when we say something's legal non-conforming, it means that it was permitted under the existing zoning bylaws when it was established. So it would be lovely if we could just get rid of those existing zoning bylaws altogether, and saying deleting these exceptions would get rid of the existing zoning bylaws altogether. But there is still that element of legal non-conforming use permissions that require us to actually continue to look at those existing zoning bylaws. So even deleting those exceptions doesn't mean that the existing zoning bylaws go away, because we have to review them to see if it was legally permitted under them in the first place when it was established.
Thank you. My last question is kind of a hope and a prayer. I know despite our housing shortage, we have thousands and thousands of units approved that are now over a decade old and still not built. Is there any way that either of these models would be an incentive to build, for developers to build where they already have approvals? And is there any way under future OP or future zoning that we're able to incentivize those currently approved housing?
Through you, Your Worship. So I'm going to invite my colleagues to jump in if I miss this, but I think that the only way under the existing system with the existing language of the exceptions to incent developers to take advantage of existing approvals would be option number 2, which is the potential of deleting those approvals if from the new zoning bylaw. So in order to have legal non-conforming use permissions, you actually have to establish the use when you have that permission. So the thought that they would be losing their permission might help to encourage people to actually take advantage of that before the new zoning bylaw is passed.
So option 2 would be better, even though you're recommending option 1. Okay, thank you for your honesty. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Councillor. Commissioner Agnew, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, thank you. And through your worship, just an update for council, because it has been some time since we brought that report back in March of 2021. So Councillor Neal, you're totally correct. When we started looking at this 2017, 2018, when we had our very low vacancy rates, we did at that time have a huge number of projects, thousands of units that were either approved through zoning but hadn't proceeded to building permits. A number of them were also tied up at the LPAT. I think we were around 6,000 units at that time. My last look of doing the math in the last week, we're down to something like maybe 2,000 units from where we once were. And that's reflective of the fact that we've built almost 4,000 units in the last 3.5 years. So I think we don't have the backlog that we once had, but certainly to your point, we don't want to get there again. And there are additional things that we're doing outside of the zoning bylaw, like looking at the site plan control bylaw and looking at things like servicing allocation and sunset clauses and those types of pieces that can also help to ensure we don't get back there beyond anything council decides to do with the zoning bylaw, if that's helpful.
Thank you. And that reminded me of one other question. So I lied when I said the last one was my last question. I know that we have bump ups for site plan, which I think we appreciate that opportunity. Is it within our power under the Planning Act, or has anybody had bump ups allowed from Committee of Adjustment, or would that be contrary to the official to the Planning Act? A trick question. Sorry.
Sorry, no, I can take a stab at that. My hand up button wasn't working. And perhaps Ms. Morley may want to chime in if I'm incorrect in anything. So under the planning legislation, council has the ability to delegate authority for certain matters to the Committee of Adjustment, and you set up that Committee of Adjustment that deals with certain matters. So as far as I know, because council has delegated that authority to the Committee of Adjustment, it doesn't work the same way in terms of a bump up, but I stand to be corrected on that. I'm not familiar with that happening, but perhaps Ms. Morley could respond to that more thoroughly.
Thank you.
Ms. Morley.
Thank you, and through you, your worship. That's absolutely correct, Commissioner Agnew. Council has delegated authority to the Committee of Adjustment through a bylaw to process certain types of applications under the Planning Act. So if council desired to take back that authority, it would involve either repealing that bylaw or amending it in some way to take over that power.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, next is Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. I just wonder, with historic site-specific zoning permission on properties that have not been developed, could there be some scenarios where actually the new zoning bylaw would be more appealing to the landowner? And like, what kind of process do we have? Are we going to incorporate this in case a property owner may want to actually have the property be assessed in the new zoning bylaw, and that would give us an opportunity to move it out of the hole and put it into our zoning bylaws. So are there some opportunities there, and what kind of outreach are we having with property owners?
Through you, your worship. So certainly I think there will be a lot of opportunities where a property owner might identify that the new zoning bylaw is more favorable than an existing exception. The intention with the proactive review of the red exceptions, if the holes approach is the preferred approach of council, is that review of exceptions would include the engagement with the property owners to actually contact them and have the conversation, but to ensure that we understand what their desires are and they actually understand the potential outcomes of it. So certainly the intention would be that through that proactive process, we would be engaging the property owners in that review. Obviously, within the overall scope of the new zoning bylaw project, it would be impossible for us to do that on every property before the new zoning bylaw is passed. So I think that's another one of the benefits of the holes approach would be that we could actually engage the property owners and have that conversation.
And the other approach would not have any engagement with specific property owners? That wouldn't be part of the process?
Through you, your worship, the process with the other approach would be basically the same public consultation that's happening on the new zoning bylaw overall, which is meeting all of the notice requirements of the Planning Act, going above and beyond in a number of ways, but the direct outreach to every single property owner, because every single property is impacted by the new zoning bylaw, it is not something that's done within the notices that are provided under the Planning Act.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? Councillor Kelly.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson. Through you, I think this is related to Councillor Doherty, so I'm not trying to be repetitious, but I'm trying to think very practically about homeowners specifically, so residential properties, that if we went with the holes approach, is it that neighbors could have different zoning bylaws on non-site specific issues? So not about what's built there, but on trailer bylaw or pipeline setbacks or the other facets of the new zoning bylaw. If there is a hole for one neighbor, would those other aspects of the new zoning bylaw not apply?
Through your worship, yes, there's definitely that potential. So say there was a site-specific exception in a residential zone with the holes approach, if the existing provisions of 8499 applied, they would certainly have different provisions for parking and pipelines and everything that you've mentioned that would be included in the general provisions. I would note that with any property, when it was established, so say with the legal non-conforming use provisions, that same property, if you deleted that exception, they would have those same legal non-conforming use permissions because they would have developed their property under the bylaw that was in effect at the time. So if we changed a provision in the new zoning bylaw, those same legal non-conforming use permissions would continue to protect those properties in the same way, as long as it's continued to be used for that same purpose.
My second question, and will be my final one for now, is pretty high level, but I'm wondering if we're intending to simplify our bylaw system across the corporation, doesn't the holes approach continue the fact that we'll have now 4 different bylaws, the 3 that exist currently, plus the new zoning bylaw for the non-hold areas?
Ms. Morley.
Thank you, and through your worship, the holes approach does require us to keep the existing zoning bylaws in effect. But what I think is important to note that we're talking about 5% of the properties in the city being subject to these red exceptions. 95% of the properties in the city will be governed by the new zoning bylaw. And the intent is to reduce that 5% coverage under other bylaws over time by bringing those 5% properties into the new zoning bylaw.
Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Hutchison, you have this thing where you kind of lean on your hand, and that's it's the signal. Okay. Yes, you're next.
Yeah, indecision on exactly what I wanted to ask. Thank you to Councillor Kiley. I had almost exactly the same question. And there's a lot of them. And so that was well clarified. I'm going to ask a very similar question because I think this is, it keeps coming up. And I want to be clear about it. The red exemption would, the holes in the holes approach, the red site exemptions status would prevail as long as there's no change in use. I suppose it's both a quality and a quantity issue. I mean, if you wanted to double the size of the building, would the old bylaw or the new bylaw apply? Like, what I'm looking for is, what is the minimum to trigger a move to the new bylaw? Like, wanting to change, like, you know, change their parking requirements, you know. I mean, it seemed to me some of the answers were suggesting that you want the new parking requirements under the new bylaw, then you have to move into the new zoning bylaw, and otherwise it's the old bylaw. And so the question of what is the minimum provocation for staff to say, no, you got to go to the new bylaw. Is that a reasonable question?
Through you, your worship. So it's a really difficult question to answer hypothetically. The existing exceptions are all written in a very site-specific manner that's reflective of the development application that was proposed at the time that the exception was passed. So as long as any new development on that lot continued to conform exactly with the way that that exception was written in the context of the existing zoning bylaw, they would be allowed to continue to develop that lot in that manner with the holes approach. There would be, if they were asking for some type of revision, it would certainly be a discussion with staff, whether it's a rezoning application or a minor variance. And I think we would obviously try to bring them into the new zoning bylaw, and likely through a rezoning application for future development on those properties. So it's a really difficult question to answer hypothetically, but there are opportunities for further development on those properties if it continues to conform with the exception.
Okay, so in your answer, which is quite consistent with what you said before, the key word is exactly. So, do you see the problem? Understanding what exactly is happening here is that at some level we would let you go along with the old bylaw as long as you exactly are in line with it. But you can see that there's going to be a desire by some to, cherry pick the requirements of whatever bylaw it is, and so that it doesn't trigger that move. And I respect your answer. I'm just saying it's difficult to quite perceive what the effect will be, and that's what really matters, at the ground level. you're talking to people. Is there anything? No. Okay.
Right.
Anything else to clarify that?
Thank you, and through your worship. So Councillor Hutcherson, you're right. It is a very important question, and I understand why Ms. Flaherty is being guarded in what she's saying, because there are so many different permutations of what we could be talking about. It's not like an apple is an apple is an apple. And when you're talking about the expansion of a legal non-conforming use, there's tests that you have to look at, and it's really about not increasing the degree of non-conformity. But to Laura's point, depending on what the site-specific exemptions are, it gets complicated. I think what council needs to understand, or what is important to understand, and I know Councillor, this is about what degree triggers this process. So if an applicant is going outside of the permissions of their site-specific exemption, then that's going to trigger a process under the Planning Act. It may be a minor variance, it may be a rezoning, it depends on what it is, but when those new processes are triggered, they're reviewed against the official plan because they're a net new. So the full weight of the net new provisions get applied against whatever that is from a test perspective to look at whether it's appropriate. I know that's kind of a high level answer, and there's lots of variations depending on the site specific nature of the policy, but that's generally how it would be approached and what would apply to any kind of net new consideration beyond the site specific permissions that exist.
Right. What I'm trying to get at is, as well, that was a good answer. Is people saying, well, Joe got this, why can't I? You get, you got it. Well, if it was under the old bylaw, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But but at some point, it's going to be difficult for people to understand why you allowed that one to stay in the old bylaw and this one to proceed. I'm not sure you've got anything else to say. I'm just pointing out that, and that's what undermines people's faith in the bylaw, is when these exemptions keep happening and no one can really figure out what, not no one, but in the general public cannot figure out why certain things are happening. That's what I'm getting at, in part. So, okay, I guess that just leaves that there. So, unless somebody wants to say something. Okay, so my next question is, there's a general perception perhaps that if we go to the zone, I can't remember the name of the second option. There's the whole approach and the zoning.
The legal non-conforming use.
Legal non-conforming, sorry, approach. In the new bylaw, presumably we're trying to bring in some progressive or forward-looking changes, which have been, indicated tonight, some of them. And so if we don't use that second option of legal non-conforming, are we sentencing the rest of the city to being behind the times? Like, unlike Councillor Neal, I think this could hang on for decades and decades, so in some form. So that some of the zoning is less progressive than the rest. I mean, that's certainly going to happen on day one.
Through your worship, so certainly the holes approach, which would maintain existing permissions, is being proposed because there's a potential that some of those red exceptions don't conform with our official plan. So the very nature of that holes approach is founded on the idea that some of them are really outdated standards that don't conform with our OP policies and our vision for future growth. So the legal non-conforming approach would certainly help to get rid of some of those older legacy type exceptions that would potentially bring a property more into compliance with the vision of future growth in the official plan.
And I take it that Ms. Morley's comment that only 5% of the properties are really affected under the whole approach anyway. Did I hear that correctly? Right, okay, yes. Okay, so a couple of process questions. Yeah, can we have Ms. Flaherty send her slide deck to council? Since this is a very long process we're involved in. Thank you. And tonight we're primarily concerned on how to treat the red site exceptions through the holes approach or the zoning approach. Will the council and public have the opportunity to at a subsequent meeting to raise other issues with the proposed zoning bylaw, which you outlined a number of them? But I think my speaking with councilors, they've got some other concerns that are perhaps not there in that list. Either way, is there going to be a meeting where we can address those?
Commissioner Agnew.
Thank you, and through you and Ms. Flaherty may want to add additional information. Staff are open to working with members of the public right up until the time that we have a council decision. So any feedback, we've been trying to provide, long lead times for feedback. I think with respect to the second draft we have right now, we've had a 2-month window for review, but recognizing people are busy and it's also very complicated. We're open to receiving feedback for sure, Councillor. We are hoping to have some direction tonight on the exceptions piece, but council won't have the full bylaw before it for several months in terms of a final decision and staff recommendations. So we do have a number of intervening months, but I think the key message is we want to encourage people to reach out and get engaged in the process to the greatest extent possible. As early in the process as possible, but there will be other opportunities, of course, to continue to work and provide feedback, yes. And we do have a statutory public meeting coming up of planning committee in December, and people often have comments that are provided through various public meetings and processes. It's just the way that it works in planning and where the information shows up, but we're taking all that information and constantly reviewing it. And since we've issued the draft, we've been working on revisions ever since we issued draft 2. So it will continue to be an iterative process.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Councillor Chappell.
Never find that mouse, Your Worship. Thank you very much. The dual screen just has fun with me. My question is really, we're being asked to frame a question today in 2 options. And I think it's been very helpful to have the presentation that we had this evening. So my question really is, if council does make a decision to go with the holes approach, for example, what would it take to encourage staff to reach out to those, 1,100 or 8, whatever the number was, the more than 800 red zone places, but all those places that would be impacted by this new bylaw, just to make sure that if there are any issues that that the property owner might have, I just think that this is such a substantive change that it would be incumbent upon us as council, even if it's in our final tax bill for these residents, to have them informed directly rather than being responsible to look online or participate at a planning committee meeting. And I'm wondering, is that something that's envisioned by the planning staff to do a proper notice in that regard?
Commissioner Agnew.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor Patterson. So certainly, Councillor Chappell, you agree with the importance of public engagement on this. We've been trying really hard to get people engaged through the whole process, but when we're talking about site-specific pieces, it does have an added level of concern for individuals, and people are often not as connected to their zoning or their property permissions as maybe they should be up until the time where they want to do something with their property and then they have a challenge. So what we'd be talking about is probably about 2,000 letters that we would need to send out to property owners to address what you're talking about, which staff are able to do. The thing I would flag is that I think we would need to lengthen the time of the completion of the bylaw, because once we send out the 2,000 letters, we then have to do the follow-up and provide timing to be able to meet and receive any responses and then make corresponding changes. So we are able to do it, but we are not able to do it within the timing of presenting the final bylaw in February. But happy to take that direction if that's what council would like us to do.
I only frame it in that regard because we've all been Zoomed to death with COVID. And, you know, when someone receives a letter in the mail, they're so excited they'll actually open it and read it. And if it's only a matter of 2,000 names, I do think that's a worthwhile cause. And since you've given me the addresses, in effect, I don't mind even writing a letter myself for my district. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. We will move on. So we have no other briefings. Are there any petitions to present? Okay, so we have nothing else, no deferred motions. So we will move on to reports. First up is report number 98 from the CAO.
Moved by Councillor Hill, seconded by Councillor Holland, that report number 98 from the Chief Administrative Officer recommend be received and adopted.
Okay, so there's just the one clause, new citywide zoning bylaw. Is there any discussion? Okay, seeing none, then we will call the vote on clause 1. All those in favor? Opposed? And that carries. Was there any opposed? So I think it carried unanimously. Okay. All right. So moving on, we have nothing from committee of the whole. We have no other information reports or miscellaneous business. If there's no other business, then Madam Deputy Clerk, I will ask for bylaws, please.
Moved by Councillor Hutchison, seconded by Councillor Osanek, that bylaw 1 be given its first and second reading.
All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried.
And our final bylaw vote, moved by Councillor Hutchison, seconded by Councillor Osanek, that bylaw 1 be given its third reading.
All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Motion to adjourn, please. Moved by Councillor Bohm, seconded by Councillor Hill. Favor? Opposed? And that carries. Have a good night, everybody.